welcome to the Intentional Clinician podcast. I'm your host, Paul Krauss, licensed professional counselor. On today's episode, we are going to have a special guest, Andrew Tennison, who is the author of Killing the Bear, Surviving Teen Addiction. It's a true story of teen addiction and a guide for parents and others on how to help. A little bit about the book. Over the past 50 years, the face of addiction has changed in America. It has become much younger. It is estimated that 90% of serious problems with alcohol and drugs in our country begin between the ages of 12 and 20. Unfortunately, our efforts towards prevention and treatment of drug and alcohol use by youth have not kept pace with this new reality. Programs such as DARE have made no discernible difference in the rate of teen alcohol and drug use, and only 30% of our treatment programs for addiction provide services to adolescents. For parents who have found themselves dealing day to day with a teen caught in the grips of addiction, the gap between this new reality and the inadequate remedies is often overwhelming. As they see their teens slip into patterns of behavior common to addiction, apathy, aggression, dishonesty, and hopelessness, they find themselves lost and terrified. Despite a successful career in the field of mental health, Andrew Tennison was one of these such parents. While he knew how to help children and teens who had suffered from abuse and neglect, he knew nothing about how to help his own son Ian as he slipped into the netherworld of aggressive alcohol and drug use. Killing the Bear is his story about what it is like to be a parent of a teen struggling with addiction and what he did about it. Written for parents who are traveling a similar path or those who want to help such families, Killing the Bear provides a personal account and the practical ways of surviving this addiction. Okay, thank you and welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Paul.
Absolutely. So I have to say, first off, I loved the book. I hope it becomes more widely available, but people can find the book. So I will have the link to that in my notes of this show for people to purchase it, which I think is a very useful book. And I wanted to talk about a little bit about your story, if you're willing to just kind of tell the audience a little bit about yourself and the story.
Certainly. Well, as you read, I worked my entire adult career was working in the field of mental health, working with kids that had suffered abuse and neglect, serious abuse and neglect, and I was pretty successful as program director for that program. But in the middle of that career, my son began developing problems with alcohol and drugs, and I really didn't know literally the first thing about what was causing this. I assumed, like most parents did, that my son was my report card. Therefore, it had to be me somehow, that something I had missed, and I had to solve this problem for him. And almost all the approaches I used, or certainly all the early ones I used, really didn't make things better. In fact, it seemed to make things worse. So I began writing this once I finally got into some recovery groups, a local recovery group, and I realized that what I was going through, I didn't intend to write a book. It was more of a journal, and I knew what I was going through was significant, and I should be writing this down, because I wanted to remember this period of my life. And it was interesting, those early manuscripts compared to the way it actually turned out.
Yes, and in your story, there actually is a happy ending.
Yes.
I mean, it's still continuing, but
right.
Your son eventually did recover, and you have a fantastic relationship with him at this point.
Yeah, things are much better than when they were when this book began.
I wanted to say that, I wanted to spoil that for the audience so they could know that you do this, not every family has success, but you found some ways through going through this really difficult trial that lasted years that did help you. And in the book, you mentioned a few things already, but you are definitely very confessional about your own bewilderment, difficulties understanding what he was going through, and just the sheer amount of complexity of this situation. And I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, I mean, I felt having gotten into a recovery group. The basis of all recovery, in my view, is honesty, and I think you have to be honest with yourselves and other people, and that's really healing. To honestly look at things you did or things you missed. I mean, I was a good parent. A lot of parents that struggle with this are good parents. They don't have the information. They're bewildered. They don't quite understand what in the world has happened to their kid. They feel like some alien came and snatched their son or daughter away and replaced them with somebody else. And it's an astounding change for the parents, and they're just at a loss. And I certainly was. I think in some ways, it took me 8 years to actually get into a recovery group, which is longer than I would recommend. But
Right.
I showed up when I was ready. But my professional background in some ways was an impediment. There was a certain amount of arrogance and pride and shame. How could I have a son with this kind of problem? But I had to get past that. It took me 8 years to get to the point where I showed up at a meeting and began really listening. But I made it there, and that didn't cause my son to get better. He did that, but it allowed me to get out of the way and allow him to experience recovery without my interference.
A lot of good points were made right there, and I think one of the points that I really want to emphasize at the beginning here is that when you have a child or a loved one or anyone in your family who's suffering from an addiction of any sort, whether it be alcohol and drugs like we're talking about, or pornography or gambling or internet or food or whatever it is, or a phone for that matter, there can be a lot of shame around that and feelings of responsibility. And especially you being a mental health worker, we see all this data, the Adverse Child Experiences Study, when children are abused or neglected, all of these hard medical outcomes are worse, more likely to be addicted to drugs and alcohol, more likely to be obese, more likely to have risky sexual behavior, be arrested, have higher blood pressure, all of these things, right? So knowing that information, it's like, well, my child in all, from an objective medical model was not an adverse child experiences study. He wasn't abused. He wasn't neglected. My wife and I, this is what I'm reading from the book, my wife and I tried our best. We sent him to a good school. We invested all this time and effort in parenting and character, and you had involvement in your local church and all these other clubs and sports from what I read from the book. And yet then there was this, all of a sudden, like you said, like all of a sudden my son isn't who I thought he was, or who I think he should be, considering the environment he's been in, as a social worker. His environment, some things influenced his environment that were outside of your control. And as you know, that's part of being a parent, is letting go of control little by little, like you said, getting out of the way. But I think it was very difficult. I could read in your story, it was very difficult to face how bad it really was, because this is not something you ever had expected to occur based on the lifestyle choices that you made.
Yeah, it's good for us to take into account what happens between a parent and a child, because it is significant, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the outcomes for children as they grow into adulthood are always determined by what a parent does or doesn't do. We certainly can have some influence, but as you said, I was 6 years on the school board. I was a school board president at a small Catholic school. Served as athletic director. I served on community boards to help with different projects. So I felt I was doing the right things. We were deeply involved in our kids' education. That was just part of the requirement at the private schools that our kids went to, and yet this happened, and I wasn't sure really how to deal with it. I first of all, I did what most parents do. I blamed other people. That's always, unfortunately, what most of us do. When something goes really wrong, you have to find out, well, who's causing this? And it certainly couldn't be me or my family, so I had to be somebody else. But and I don't mean to make light of that. That tends to be the what a lot of parents do, and it's natural, but it's not productive. And that isn't to say we have to blame ourselves entirely, but we have to be honest about what we do, what we know, what we don't know, our own patterns of drinking, our attitudes about drug and alcohol use. And be honest with what we're seeing. If our son or daughter is really changing for the worse, we really have to be willing to look at that and not deny that or blame other people for it, but really pursue the help that's out there. Now, I'll tell you that the help that was out there back then, and even the help that's out there right now, frankly, is pretty minimal. As you read earlier, 90% of addiction in this country, people that struggle with addiction, 90% of them began using during their teen years, and yet we have very few adolescent programs out there. And the programming should begin by middle school. That's when it began with my son, his experimenting. And, we know that 80 to 90% of the kids that struggle by late years in high school began in middle school years. That's something I had no idea of, and most parents don't. They cannot believe their middle school kid is starting to use, but that's the kids that struggle. That's when most of them begin using.
And that's a really good point I want to jump off of just for a second to go right to brain science. So the younger you use, this is statistics, this is backed up by multiple research studies, the younger you start using regularly, the more difficult usually the addiction substance use disorder is to break. Because I think, from what I've read, you're wiring different experiences or different coping skills with the drug or alcohol. You're pairing it, and you're pairing it quite young when the brain is really developing. Now, we know from brain science that the new studies are saying that the brain kind of stops its growth pattern around 24 to 27 now, before you can still, learn new things, but it's not generating new cells like it was.
Yeah.
However, think about middle school, 13, 14 years old. I mean, your brain is very much in development, and if you start pairing that with drugs and alcohol, it becomes almost, part of yourself. Whereas if you start drinking or smoking or using drugs as an adult, you remember what it's like not to. And so, just with brain science, it becomes more difficult. And I think also, like you said, it's hard for parents to even fathom that this is going on. And, there's that shame factor. How could I have not known? Or also sometimes shrugging their shoulders. What am I supposed to do? Not let him go anywhere? Not let him have a phone? Keep him in my basement? They're supposed to go into the community. And, there's a network of kids who are experimenting for various reasons, whether it be coping or a thrill seeking or just, thinking that this is the thing to do. They can easily be exposed, and, some don't regularly use and they've experimented and that's it. But if you have any genetic disposition for addiction or are going through maybe a rough emotional time, which most teenagers are.
At some point, yes.
At some point or another, they do. They go through their own, because of hormones and growing up and all of this, it can be an easy thing to quell some of your stress. And that's all of that can be dangerous. So I think, like what you said, it's difficult being a parent because you don't want to become the helicopter parent, and you also don't want to be the parent who's out to lunch and just hoping that things. So how do you navigate that, especially coming from your story, being so involved in his life, and then all of a sudden here we are, shock. How could this have occurred?
Yeah, we haven't talked about this, but eventually one of the things I had the opportunity to do and the privilege to do was to start an adolescent treatment program at the agency where I worked. And one of the things that was most interesting to me was the onset of use and parental discovery of drug use. There was a 3-year gap there. That is, kids would, on average, started using around age 12 or 13, and parents discovered it at age 15 or 16. That was almost universal, that 3-year gap. And many of these were very good parents. They had other kids that did very well. By all sorts of measures, these were competent, good, caring parents, and yet they didn't see it. And that was certainly my experience. I didn't know until I began working in the field what some of the common behavioral signs, emotional signs, and just the physical signs. I learned certainly by living with the problem, but I wish I had known back then. I used to, when I gave talks at local schools and I would talk about the signs of use, there would be parents in the audience and I would just see their jaw drop or their head drop. When I talked about certain things, it was like the light bulb went on. Oh, that's what my kid's doing. That's what's going on. They aren't, though, the signs are not that difficult to detect if you know what to look for. And I certainly wish I had known that. And one of the things I did in those groups was to share with parents some of the things that would tell you if you see several of these signs, you should begin to investigate whether or not your son or daughter is using.
And that's a good point. And I think I want to talk about a few of those signs because I also think a lot of times a parent will bring a child to a therapist and they don't want family therapy. They want the child to go to individual therapy, which is more common for adults. Adults often go to individual therapy to work through something in their life, and that's what they do. And they sometimes go to couples therapy. But with children, we've talked already that off the mic that we think that it's absurd to not involve the family system unless the family system is the one abusing the child, which does happen. You worked in that environment for a while, but in your career. But if the family is a functioning family and non-abusive, and the members are trying to help, it's very important to get the parents into the therapist, even if the therapist sees the child independently for some sessions, but to always have that family therapy component because of various reasons. The child only has a limited view of what's going on. And also, going off that, my point was a lot of therapists and doctors and psychiatrists don't see it because they see all of maybe some of these moodiness or isolative behaviors as major depression, which it might also be co-occurring, but what is the obstacle, the cure for the major depression? Is there major drug use going on that's completely altering the mood as well? So can you talk a little bit about those signs?
Yeah, first I'll talk about my own experience.
Oh, yeah, let's go there.
One of the things in terms of this question, though, it's a very important area for parents to be aware of. One of the things, my son started using marijuana in 8th grade, began experimenting, and by the time I discovered it 3 years later, it had really become a larger part of his life. Well, one of the effects of marijuana use, chronic marijuana use, and he wasn't using the low level, he was using the stuff the kids would call chronic, but just much more potent forms of marijuana. It affects their ability to concentrate and to learn. So he was struggling in school. So I took him to see a local counselor who specialized in treating ADHD, and sure enough, he had ADHD. I was told that, and prescribed stimulant medication, Ritalin or Adderall. I don't recall which. It was some time ago. But things didn't get any better because that was not the problem. I joked later on that he did have ADHD. He had always drunk and high disorders, what he had.
Right.
He was getting stoned every day, throughout the day, and it's difficult to learn. And that's what needed to be addressed. Now, as you said, there are co-occurring disorders, but one of the problems with chronic aggressive drug use is that it always looks like mental illness. Mm-hmm. It'll look like depression, anger, and certainly it'll look like family dysfunction if you see the whole family. The family, it may be a loving and caring, non-abusive, non-neglectful family, but when addiction hits a family, the normal course of events, unless the parents are in recovery and really know what they're dealing with, is to become pretty dysfunctional. because as the teen who is struggling with drugs and alcohol can't cope with life because they can't manage things, the parents and other family members fill in and try to take care of things for them, and it looks very dysfunctional. And a family therapist could look at that and say, well, maybe the kid's using because the parents are so angry. Well, maybe they're angry because the kid's using. And so it's important to really do it's important to do a diagnostic workup with not just the team, but also the family. When we ran the program that I was involved with, we spent the 2 hours doing an assessment with the team, but 2 hours with the family, and then we would get them together, because it wasn't that the family had caused this. They don't cause the addiction to occur, but they can delay the day of reckoning that every alcoholic or addict needs to get better by enabling, by blaming other people, by all sorts of things that parents typically do.
And it's, yes, and I want to go into that because the family system changes. We know from all the literature about, there was a lot of literature in the 70s and 80s about families of alcoholics.
Right.
And focusing on the father or the mother as the alcoholic and all the roles people took. Well, let's just reverse that for a second. When the child is dealing with an addiction, and that's the primary identified patient, as we say, the family system tries to adjust and adapt. They're doing the best they can, but they might be reacting out of fear, guilt, shame, thinking they can help a lot. So what you said, enabling, but a lot of parents don't see it that way. They say, I'm the parent, this is a minor, I've got to do my best, I've got to help, I've got to make sure that they're okay, and I got to make sure they're not emotionally distraught, and I've got to listen to their complaints, and I've got to be there for them, because otherwise I'm a failing parent. And what you said right there, parents don't see it. That's the positive side. The shadow side to that is enablement and codependence, where my feelings as a good parent are dependent on how well my child's doing, and how well my child's doing, I need to be filling in these gaps or difficulties, school, whether it be school or achievement or ability to do well in something or cope with something. I've got to help them cope, but it becomes too much. So then the child, when they're little, you really need to help a child. When they're really small, you got to help them walk, you got to help them learn to talk, you got to help them make sure they don't stick their fingers in outlets, make sure they don't eat something they're allergic to, make sure they don't go outside at night by themselves, all these things. But when you get to teenage years, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit of both. You got to make sure they're safe, but what about letting them have the correct dose of stress so that they're in the zone of proximal development and learning to cope emotionally, and learning to do their homework, and learning to face difficulties. And when they are doing something such as drug use or something wrong or being disrespectful, holding them accountable. How do we do that in a way that's balanced and lets them experience stress, but not too much stress, not on the a lot of parents are reacting to that old world parenting that was authoritarian. They don't want to do that. So then they go too soft. They're running, like I think there was something in your book, I was running around with pillows, catching him when he fell. And so that's a difficult piece for parents. And so then, okay, well, I'll bring him to the therapist. Well, if the therapist doesn't understand that you have to also deal with the family system, because they're treating this child like an adult client. And adult clients, yes, the family system could be very helpful to bring in, but a lot of times the adult does not want to bring their family system in, and that's their choice. Right. For teenagers, unless it's an abusive situation, that shouldn't be a choice. That should be part of the treatment plan, to have the family in, even if the family comes alone without the child, just to get some insight of what's going on. And hopefully, best practice, bringing them all together and doing some sessions. But that piece right there, I think, you said delaying the day of reckoning or the day of facing what's going on. And I think parents don't know they're doing it. And it's very difficult to unravel that because of the multiple complexities. So can you elaborate on that?
Parents jumping in to try to help out. Unfortunately, the word enabling has become used so commonly that it's almost lost its meaning. So part of it, the way to understand this is really jumping in to try to help, but the help is really not helpful. One of the most interesting things I found in going to recovery groups were adults who started using as teenagers, who would tell you that I'm 45 years old, I have a job, I'm a competent professional, but I'm 14 years old. I've never really grown up, because part of adolescence is learning. You've been told all your life hopefully as a kid, you're the best thing since sliced bread, we love you, you could do anything. High school and the adolescent years, the time to find out that's really not true, but you're good at some things, so let's find out what those are and let's really develop those. But also learning how to cope with disappointment and loss, frustration, joy, the whole range of feelings without falling apart. And unfortunately, if they've been coping with drugs and alcohol as a way to deal with these feelings, they really don't grow up emotionally, and that's a real risk. Parents don't do this intentionally. They sense at a basic gut level that there's something really wrong and I want to help out. So they help out in ways they've been doing all their lives with their younger kids, and it's not helpful. It's helping them stay stuck. It's helping them stay involved with drugs and alcohol, because they really aren't being challenged. Now, it's the way out of this is not easy. It's not easy for the teen, especially because of the paucity of services that are available to teens out there. Unfortunately, in our culture, we wait till adults are almost completely broken and grudgingly provide detox services and maybe some counseling services, but really not. It's not offered graciously and willingly and at a level that's needed in our culture. And I don't know what it takes with the opioid crisis we have right now, what it takes to get people's attention that we need to do something about this. But anyways, the point is, parents mean well, but there aren't many services out there, resources out there, and so that they try to handle it on their own in ways that really don't help.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And we will talk at the end more about what services are available and some of the support groups parents can get involved in for free if they can't afford services. And there's also books at libraries, and this book isn't that expensive. You can probably afford this no matter what your income level. And some things that we will kind of go to the solution side. But I think you're hitting on a macro issue, which is we have a cultural trouble in the U.S. with people growing up emotionally. There's a lot of reasons to not grow up emotionally. We don't have an agreed upon entry point. I mean, we say at 18 you're grown up, you can do what you want now, you're emancipated, and you can buy cigarettes and whatever. But we don't have an agreed upon way to have a child grow up emotionally. And so there's a lot of complexities. And I mean, you can read in the literature, there's countless books on this about how other cultures used to do it traditionally and how some parts of our culture do it and ways to do it. But I would say that that's not mainstream. I would say that that's not what is in the news as much, in the media especially. That's a complex issue, and you said the way out of this is difficult. So once it starts, parents are, might be panicking and not knowing what to do at all, and just looking desperately for help. I think that's a very good point. I wanted to ask you some more, maybe to share a little bit more about your story and what you did do, even throughout. We've talked about the difficulties not seeing it. It got to the point where he got arrested, and it was still difficult to see it. You tried, I don't want to give away the whole book, but you tried a multitude of different types of therapies with him that basically went nowhere because they didn't address the family system. That's part of the reason.
Right.
Which you found out from Hazelden was an important aspect, which you brought into your program. But what are some things that maybe brought you to the point where you changed the way you were working with your son and all of that?
Well, actually, oddly enough, failure helped. My failed attempts to do things, and I did what most parents do. When my son first got arrested, I screamed and demanded he stop, and with no appreciation of how far along he was with his drug use. He was not just experimenting; it was more more than that. And so my screaming really just, he endured that, probably got high, and then ignored that. When the problem didn't go away, and this was odd because he was a great kid growing up. I never had difficulties with him listening or following the rules of the house. So this was a whole new thing. So I thought this screaming would work. Well, it didn't. So I eventually took him to a therapist when he got arrested again, and this therapist treated it as a ADHD problem, which, if you don't understand what the problem is, you're not going to come up with the right solution. He didn't need stimulant medication to be able to study better. He wasn't interested in stimulant medication. He was interested in marijuana. He wanted to mellow out. He didn't want to get, worked up. Eventually, you talked about parents taking it easy on their kids with the enabling. I certainly did that, but I also, at a certain point when that doesn't work, you revert back to the screaming. And so I did what most parents did. I screamed and I enabled and I screamed. I enabled because I felt bad about what was going on. I screamed because I got frustrated, and I enabled because I felt guilty about the screaming. I eventually found myself going to, after about 8 years of dealing with this, going to a mixed AA Al-Anon meeting, which was odd because I heard about this through my daughter. My oldest daughter told me about this meeting. I said, well, I had done a little research on AA and the whole 12-step movement. I said, there's no such thing as a combined AA and Al-Anon meeting. She said, well, maybe there isn't, but I went to it last night, so maybe you ought to. and I did go, and it was that was very helpful for me because I was able to listen to people that were in recovery who had problems like my son had earlier in their life, and they weren't angry, they weren't bitter, they were some of the most honest, decent people. And I needed to see that. I needed to see people could get beyond their addiction. And waiting inside every person struggling with addiction was a great person waiting to come out. Or at least I came to believe that. Maybe that's not true, but an awful lot of people, they're great people waiting to come out, but they just need to get into the recovery process. I needed to see that. I needed hope. I often tell parents, your son or daughter needs limits and boundaries. That's really important. You need to learn to say no, and it takes a lot more love to say no than yes at times. But they also need hope, and we need hope, and we need to go to places of hope. And that was a place of hope for me, to see people can get better. They can become not only okay, they can become great people if they embrace the recovery process. And a lot of them were in therapy as well. By this time I was reading a lot about addiction, trying to understand it. It's just the way I cope with things. I want to understand. Once I got past the denial and understood what I was dealing with, and if it's addiction, sooner or later you'll know. Sooner or later, no matter what, they get sloppy. They don't cover up their tracks nearly as well as they did in the early years, and you will know unless you're absolutely blind to it. But I certainly, knew what I was dealing with. I was studying it, but I learned so much by just listening to addiction, coming from people that were struggling with it. Everything I learned in those books was verified by what I heard these people talking about. It was... So I've read everything I can get my hands on. Just because the topic fascinates me, but I learned just as much by listening to people talk about their own struggles. And eventually, after about 4 years of going to that recovery group, there was a story in there. The guy that founded the group, he's since passed away, but he talked about his own situation with his getting into recovery and getting into treatment and recovery, and how his wife waited 24 years
patiently
for him to ask for help. because he wasn't abusive, he wasn't an unpleasant person, but he was an alcoholic, clearly was. And his wife knew that because she was in recovery herself, and she knew she had to ask him if he really wanted help. He had to ask for help, and she had to say, do you really want it? There was something about that story that just resonated with me. And when my son reached a critical point, I've been going to this meeting for about 4 years. He had been on a 1.5-day bender and was really suicidal, just like most people struggling with addiction will be sooner or later. My daughter brought him over, and he asked for help, and I said, do you really want it? I was kind of like the same scenario I had heard, and he said, yeah, I do. And my daughter about fell off her chair when she heard me say that, because she knew that I had been in this pattern of trying to shove recovery down his throat for 8 years in one way or the other, demand that he go to recovery and this and that. So for me to be asking, do you really want help? When he was asking for it, kind of floored her, but it was really the approach that worked. Because I had come to the conclusion, you can be supportive of someone's recovery, but you can't author it for them. They need to be the author of their own recovery. You can be a cheerleader. You can be supportive. You can provide resources. My wife and I paid for the treatment. By that time, I had decided, the boundaries I had set was I wasn't going to pay for lawyers, wasn't going to pay for fines, but bona fide treatment, absolutely. And we were lucky enough to find a good treatment program. And what was great about this treatment program, unfortunately it's not around anymore, but what was so great about this was the ongoing family involvement. We could go there for an 1.5-hour session on Wednesdays, and if we could stay and do the afternoon session as well. I went to both every week, and it was so helpful to be at the other end of the treatment, experience, being a client as a family member, but going through that process, family treatment. These were huge meetings, and at times it seemed a little chaotic, but it was so helpful. I learned so much, even when they weren't focusing on my son or us. The honesty, the clarity, was so helpful. And that's when my son really began. Several weeks into that, he said, my name is Ian and I'm an alcoholic. I was floored. And, it wasn't, things didn't work perfectly. There were relapses. There were some challenges, some relapses for me where I was hovering over him, which is not uncommon either. But he made steady, ongoing progress, and he's doing well now. Life isn't perfect, but it's going very well.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're bringing that up because there was a long road. This is not an easy road, but I did hear some things, which was, as the parent, we can't just focus on the patient or the person who's got the addiction. We've got to focus on ourselves too. We got to take care of ourselves. We got to educate ourselves. We have to be honest with ourselves, and we may even need therapy ourselves or somebody to talk to about it because of the multitude of factors. With your son, I heard you hit some key points. Eventually, my boundaries were, I will not pay for lawyers. I'm not paying for fines. I'm not bailing him out of his poor decision making or getting arrested or whatever. I'm going to pay for treatment. So it's difficult for parents to set these boundaries because what if they go homeless, or what if they are locked up for 6 months, or what if they're in trouble? Shouldn't we help them and pay for the lawyer? We have the means, or shouldn't we prevent them from going down further? And I think it's not a yes or no question. It's what we have to figure out how to emotionally support them, like you said, encouragement, and we can help with the point of treatment. And we can help with, like I've heard some parents say, I'll give hugs, food, and treatment. I'm not gonna pay that they wreck their car again. I'm not giving them a car. Well, that's impeding them economically. Well, guess what else is impeding them economically? Their addiction. And it will continue, even if they get another job, even if you get them another car. They're going to lose it. Because if you don't treat the root cause, it's going to continue to pop up. So it's difficult because part of this is it's a huge risk. When addiction's involved, people die. Right. And so how are we going to feel if our son actually or our daughter dies from addiction and we were following the boundaries? Well, they could also die from addiction because you bailed them out, put them back in a nice apartment, didn't pay for treatment, gave them a bunch of food and some resources, and they leveraged that to buy more pills, and they overdosed. It's a risk. We don't have control at a certain point. But there are things, and there are books, and there's hope. I'm getting back to hope. There are things you can learn. There are things you can do. There's support you can do. And I think that's a hard thing for parents is that, yeah, your child needs the following, and you need to make sure they, as much as you can, encourage them to get into treatment. Like you said, not you demanded, but whatever we can do, right, to leverage their ability to continue their drug lifestyle, we have to take away that support. But we do increase support of quality time, maybe food, hugs, encouragement, not lecturing. Very difficult to do because you want them to succeed, but they have to choose it. They have to choose recovery. They have to choose to admit to themselves what's going on. And we have to get out of the way. Also, while walking the line of, here are my boundaries and here are some resources. And the resources are directing them toward hopefully finding the right treatment or the right way to recover. That's a difficult path, and it's not easy. That's what you said. And I appreciate you sharing that aspect of it.
Yeah, it's not easy for the teen or the young adult struggling with the drugs and alcohol, and it's not easy for the family. You have to. There are risks, but there you have to pick your risks, and it may not seem that risky to continue to enable and protect and bail somebody out, but the risk is. Yeah, I had a friend that was in her 90s that was still treating her 65-year-old son as if he was 13. That to me is more tragic than just about anything. You run the risk of your kid, of your adult, never ever growing up, and but when you're dealing with drugs or alcohol, the risks are very high and the consequences. There's no guarantee that when you set limits and boundaries, no matter how appropriate, that they're going to survive it. They may not. But you have to ask yourself, how well is it working for us now, the way we're doing things now, by paying their mortgage, by bailing them out, by blaming other people, by doing all these things. And, unfortunately, there's no book out there that tells you exactly what to do, what boundaries, what are the appropriate boundaries. A lot of it has to be developed in the context of the relationship. What's enabling for one person may not be for another, or one family may not be for another. And sometimes you have to, just try things out. If it's enabling, you'll know it. I mean, enabling basically is aggressive drug and alcohol use always leads to some high costs and pain. If you're paying that and they're not, they're never going to have a motivation to get better. And so it's a matter of almost basic economics. Who's paying the freight? If you're paying it, why should they make any changes? Sooner or later, of course, you can't pay enough. The judge doesn't care what you think or feel when they get arrested. Their bodies will begin to break down. One of the big challenges with adolescent use is so many of the things in the adult model that we assume were motivations to change, restoring your health, restoring your career, your marriage, your standing in the community, don't apply to teens. And yet we really haven't adjusted the model to what does work with teens, what does resonate with them, what makes them think maybe I should change things.
And I think that's the interesting part. I'm glad you actually covered a bunch of things I wanted to cover, which is, I worked in the adolescent community reinforcement approach, which is an outpatient program, otherwise known as ACRA or ACRA. The family model is called CRAFT, stands for something. Can't remember exactly. And the author of that is Dr. Robert Myers and his wife, Susan. And Getting Your Loved One Sober is their book that's written for anybody. But the treatment program, when we were working with teenagers, we focused, these were teenagers that weren't in like inpatient or, like the situation where you need to go inpatient, right? They were casually smoking marijuana and it was starting to affect their school performance. So we would focus on family, getting the family involved. The parents have more power than they think, but the way they think they have power is usually incorrect. It's a fear-based reaction. This is how my parents did it. This is how I think they should do it. They need guidance, and there's no one size fits all, but you need guidance as parents. The second thing we did is we really worked with the kid on, a lot of different things for strength base. What are you good at? What do you like? Trying to get them back into activities that they liked, not because we were sure that would be the fix, but it's one of the things. If they were enjoying more pro-social activities, it's less likely they were going to do as much drug use, harm reduction. Not every kid, that doesn't apply to every kid, but it did help a lot of our kids who were more casual users. They weren't like the really, really addicted ones at that point. Changing the family dynamics was huge. Giving them choice, meaning like we would do activities that are similar to motivational interviewing, but we would weave in psychoeducation, but give them choice versus the old drug programs of DARE and things like this, or even some of the intensive outpatient groups are like, kids, drugs are bad. Shouldn't do them. They're killing you. They're bad for you. They're going to ruin your life. Blah, blah. Scare tactics. It doesn't work. They're still forming their identity. And what's a greater way to form your identity but than to rebel against authority when you're a teenager? That's a natural inclination. You're on your way to becoming your own person, your own autonomous being. You don't want people telling you what you should do with your life. You want to make that choice. So we would do activities where we'd look at the pros and cons of using, and they'd say, "What do you mean looking at the pros? Well, what are you getting out of it? What are the parts you like about it?" And we would go through every aspect. What are the parts you like about it with your feelings? What are the parts you like about it, how it makes your body feel? What are the parts you like about it with how you think? What are the parts you like about it with your friends, or using here or doing that? And you would get so much insight when we asked that positive question. And then we'd ask, what do you feel like the long-term negatives are? What do you feel the long-term negatives are in all these areas? School, family, financial, legal, friendships. And they would tell you, if they were ready. Some of the ones who were more addicted, we had to send to higher levels of care because they needed detox or whatever. They weren't appropriate for outpatient care. They would say, nothing, everything's fine. Everything will be fine. Drugs are great. All my heroes do drugs, and they're fine, until they OD. But so a lot of kids would start to get out of it and just start that kind of harm reduction, which is one approach. But that doesn't work with everybody, especially with those kids who are starting really young and are using chronically. Like your son, he used almost every day, as far as we know. And so that was one model we used, but we had to incorporate the family and we had to treat the child differently. A lot of the older models, they say, they work for adults taking responsibility and all this sort of thing, but they don't work for teens. And so that was one of the ways we worked with people on the lower end of the risk scale. On the higher end of the risk scale, absolutely my hand is in the bucket with safety first, getting them inpatient if they need to be, getting the family involved and educated, family strategic therapy, working on the patterns, working on any type of safety measure, not taking away the enablements and that the parents had been doing in their life. But there's not one size fits all, and it is a discovery journey, and it is an investment of your time and your energy. But I think getting involved and getting educated, and I'm going to read something you said here, will start to use that pent-up energy and that fear and those sleepless nights to do something that's productive, and that involves you as the parent. So here's an interesting thing you said in the book. As a lifelong Catholic, I had plenty of exposure to communal worship, and for the most part, I found it rewarding. However, nothing in my religious life compared to the simple yet penetrating honesty and support I found in Al-Anon. At times I shared my thoughts, and at other times I just sat and listened. It didn't matter. Either way, I was healing. For parents such as myself who are caught up in feelings of fear, anger, guilt, and isolation, I'm not sure there is anything more helpful than Al-Anon meetings. The program offers meditations, stories, and personal insights into how countless others have learned to deal with these feelings and emerge with a sense of hope and peace. You hear how others found themselves overwhelmed and immobilized by these feelings, and more importantly, how they got beyond them. So there's that hope factor. Yeah. There's education and hope and behavior change.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of very interesting points that brings back some memories of working with teens when we ran that program. And, one of the things I used to say was the problem with drugs and alcohol is that they work until they don't. And I would tell the teens, I'm not going to tell you didn't have a good time, that you didn't make friends, that you didn't. Because the problem with the DARE program and programs like that is that when their reality doesn't match with what you're telling them, they just laugh it off, and it makes you're not hitting home with them. But when you take the approach that you talked about, which is what did you get out of it, and then what were the losses, and you can honestly look at those things, then they can really begin to think about it. But the one lecture that I had lectures, but they were really more discussions with a group of kids. But I would say, it's not enough to quit using drugs and alcohol. I'm not asking you to do that. Let's find out what you got out of that and how you're going to get that differently without them. Because you can't just stop using. You have to figure out how you're going to fill that void with something that's healthier. And I can't tell you how much the kids, that just caught their attention because they were so used to the egg being broken in the pan and how laughable that was.
Right.
But what did make sense to them is, I got something out of it, but it's not working for me anymore. And, you talked about a strength-based approach. Our view was if they weren't having fun in treatment, they weren't getting better. You have to learn how to enjoy life again. And to do it without mood-altering substances, and it can be done, but it takes some persistence. And the family piece of it, you read the section about my experiences in Al-Anon. It's important to convince parents that they need treatment themselves. They need help and support themselves. They need hope. In order to convey hope to their kid, they need to be hopeful themselves. So they need to recover from what they've been through. Especially lately, I can't tell you how many parents I've seen that are suffering from PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
Because some of the stuff their kids have been involved in is so shocking to them, so alarming. I mean, federal agents showing up at their house or drug dealers showing up at their house, just major transactions going on in their residence. I mean, or, knowing people that have lost their kids. The stakes seem to be higher than ever. And parents, one of the most interesting things we had in that program that we ran was when the kids would get clean and sober. And we could prove it. We drug tested them. They were getting better. Their parents' initial reaction was, "Great, this is working." And then within a week or two, if they were not going to Al-Anon or some equivalent support group, they would start wondering, "How long is this going to last?" And they would begin obsessing about their recovery, like they had obsessed about their drug use, and they really, in a sense, really weren't getting better when their kids were. So it's really important for the family to recognize, I've been damaged by this. When addiction hits a family, everybody suffers. Not just the addict or alcoholic. Everybody suffers. It's a shock to the whole system, and we all have to learn how to do things differently.
Yeah, I think that is a great summary of what I was going to talk about before we get into a little bit talking about the drugs. I wanted to say one more thing, is that when we were working with these kids in the strength-based approach, one of the things we were trying to do is get their interest. What interests you? And all of the kids, if you could finally get them there, and I had a list of 20 pages. I kid you not, of activities, and I had them go through and tell me interested, not interested, sort of interested, maybe, and just try to find anything. And a lot of these kids, they wanted to become a singer, they wanted to become a teacher, they wanted to become a sports player, they were still dreaming like children. And these are adolescents, and children are supposed to dream. And this is another factor I found. Like you said, there's this great person inside waiting to come out, and they just wanted to achieve something, but they had something going on, whether it's self-esteem or anxiety about trying something, or the lack of discipline it takes to practice, or lack of resources to be able to get into something they wanted to do. That they just felt, I'm a loser. So my identity is I'm a loser, and I'm never going to be good enough, so I might as well have fun in life. And the way to have fun in my neighborhood is to use drugs and alcohol. And my parents, they say, you got to get a job. Get out there and get a job. The world economy is more competitive. You need to get your butt up there to school and get an education. And these kids are like, wait a minute, I want to try this, I want to try that, and they don't know. There's no guidance, or not no guidance, but little guidance on following a dream and how do you get there, and how do you try that. And so I had so many kids tell me that was actually one of the turning points when they just decided to really start using. Was I just felt my dreams were over, my life was over, and I was going to be just having to struggle like my parents economically, or just work all the time, and I just didn't like it. And the parents didn't know how to talk to their kids because they're stressed out with their job, even if they had a good job. Let's say they had a good job. Well, hey, you know what? It's hard to buy a house and a car. You need that. You got to really get an education. There's a lot of people trying to go to college and become whatever, and you got to pick that. And hearing that message from the kids resisted that. And so it's hard for parents to parent in a way where your fears and your countertransference about what is going to happen to your child don't dominate the conversation. Instead of finding out what special, unique thing is my kid bringing into the world or capable of, and how do I cultivate that without enabling them not to study because they're just going to be a dancer or whatever it is, but balancing that and encouraging that. And I remember, and I worked in a very difficult neighborhood, so that was more of the discussion there, was those parents were stressed out economically, and that was all coming onto the children. They were absorbing it because children absorb what you do. And that's a hard thing for parents. I mean, just as, not too long ago, you were an adolescent and you were a 20-something, and now you've got a child, and that child they don't listen to you so much what you say. They watch what you do, and their brains are soaking it up. And that means if you've got stuff you got to work on, I think that's where you got to start, besides getting your kids safe. I mean, but we got to, if for parents who are trying to prevent their kid from having an addiction, it starts with you. It starts with, what are your habits? It starts with, what are your weaknesses? What are your sore spots? Are you trying to better yourself, or are you just getting by, punching in and out of your time card? Are you happy? Do you have joy? And that is, and that's a hard one. And I'm not putting this all on parents. Your child's, like I said, what is the unique thing they're bringing into the world? Well, what if their unique thing they're bringing into the world is, I want to become a marijuana distributor? I mean, they have autonomy and choice so much younger than we give them credit for. And I think that is why people are blindsided by this middle school use. And the more and more I read, and the more I've worked with younger kids, I work with a lot of older people now, I go, you know what? That's not surprising me anymore. Because somewhere around 10 or 11, 12, they start going, wait a minute, what do I want to do? What do I want to be? And they start dreaming a little bit. And, that's where the parents' control starts to slip. They're no longer this little kid you take care of and make sure they don't bump their head. They are starting younger and younger. And I feel like in our culture, I still see it all the time. I have friends or family or whatever. Oh, don't talk about that around the kids. And okay, I get that but when do we start having adult conversations with children? When do we do that? I mean, and that's a cultural issue, I guess. I don't know. What are
What's
your thoughts?
interesting, the naming of that program that we worked in, we really gave that some thought. We ended up settling on the Discovery program because that was our thinking on that was this wasn't when you're dealing with teens, it's not a matter of recovering something you once had. It's discovering what you can be. In fact, we didn't use the Serenity Prayer, which is commonly used, and I have no problem with the Serenity Prayer, but we wanted something more relevant to the program, and it was grant me the courage to discover all that I was meant to be and the kindness to find the best in others today and the days to come. Because we wanted the courage to discover and the kindness to support other people in that same process. And like I said, it wasn't enough just to quit using. It was to discover what you were meant to be, and recognizing that the drug and alcohol use gets in the way of that, and at a certain point, it stops it entirely, and which is the really sad part.
Yeah, and there's countless examples of heroes, for kids. I remember when I was growing up, Kurt Cobain had this great career with his band Nirvana, and the drugs got to him, and then he committed suicide while using heroin.
Right.
That was the autopsy. We could go countless examples. Just recently, Prince, a couple years ago, he was abusing opiates, and his inner circle didn't force him to get treatment because they didn't know how to confront him and in a caring way. And so there are tragic stories of people with talents, but all these kids have talents inside of them that aren't being expressed, and we can't teach them that, but we can help them say, you know what, we believe in you. There's something deep, and that's when we hopefully can get that part of them that is sort of inexplicable, that excitement of forming my identity and what do I want to be in this world, and start facing some of our fears, because it's difficult to do something in this world where you actually want to, put your best foot out there. It's difficult to do that. It's easier to just go with whatever comes. So I want to talk a little bit about, I know I feel like we've got the theme here, but I want to talk a little bit just for the parents out there and just whoever wants to listen, and other therapists that listen to the show. The drugs are an issue. We need to talk. I mean, I had somebody say once that it's not the drugs that are the problem, it's how you use them. And that's true. But there's also another truth, which is the drugs are different. They're more readily available. They're more potent than ever. The stakes are higher. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I'm not as current on some of the drug issues as I once was when I worked in that treatment program, because the kids filled me in on the new stuff going on. They gave me the language and in a very helpful way. But I am still involved with parent groups, and so I hear stories. And obviously the thing that I'm hearing more and more about are the opioids and that crisis and the overdoses. I've known 5 families that have actually lost their adult children. And in most cases, it's been the opiates. And I've been going to meetings really since 2001. It was 2001 when I started. So 18 years. And up until a few years ago, there were no fatalities I had heard about. Now, 5 in the past several years. So it's gotten more dangerous, as we all know. And you certainly hear about methamphetamines, which, it's a stimulant that can certainly lead to some horrific consequences as well. The marijuana use, I mean, that was certainly the drug that my son got involved with, that a lot of young people do, and probably more now than ever, just because of the legalization and use of medical marijuana. I don't want to get into that issue. That's a very complicated issue, but the bottom line is some of the stigma associated with it has gone away. So there's higher levels of use, I think, than what we've seen before. But what's more disturbing is the potency. One of the more alarming statistics recently, that I heard was that in 1992 there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 16,500 hospitalizations for marijuana overdoses. By 2008, that number was 325,000. 325,000, so a 20-fold increase because of increase in potency. There was a time when marijuana overdoses were just unheard of, and now we're seeing that's changed. And certainly with the vaping, we're hearing more stories recently about some lung illnesses, and there's maybe some THC involvement with that as well. Too early to tell, but it's the although the opiates are getting a lot of attention, cigarettes and alcohol are really the most lethal drugs in America. Cigarettes kill about 500,000 Americans a year directly, and then alcohol use about 150,000. And not that the other drugs don't kill or damage the lives of a lot of young people, but those are still the big two, and are commonly used by teens. So.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, there's so many points in here, and the opiates, are very dangerous. I actually had a friend from high school who was a very successful musician OD 2 years ago on opiates. A common scenario, he had stopped using, and then when you go back and take your dose, it's too much,
right?
And then you got organ shutdown essentially, and you stop breathing,
right?
And so the stakes are higher in many ways, and the marijuana is more potent. One would hope that 50 years from now, our culture be mature enough to use it responsibly. Like the people in the Netherlands who legalized it so many years ago. When I was experiencing their culture when I was abroad, the people there didn't seem to smoke much. It was all tourists, and if they did, it was a once a year thing or in low moderation. And there was there's still major drug addiction problems over there as well. But there was something you wrote in here that said one of the greatest risk factors is that a teen or a person doesn't believe that the drug they're using is dangerous. And I think that's actually a huge factor when we're dealing with any drug. Obviously, people know opiates and methamphetamines and heroin are very dangerous drugs, and they have a stigma attached to them. But people don't believe marijuana and alcohol are dangerous. Now, cigarettes have been, there's been a cultural shift on cigarettes, but people still smoke anyway.
Right.
But marijuana and alcohol and, some of the synthetic drugs are a whole nother lecture we could go into that are widely available legally right now. You can order them on the internet. It's very, very dangerous. Bath salts and all of that. But the marijuana, I can't remember, you wrote something in here, it's like so much more potent than it was in the 60s and 70s. And so there's an attitude towards it where a lot of parents just see like, oh, well, that's just normal. Kids smoke pot in high school a little bit. I did. I'm fine. Well, right, you were smoking THC grade about 5% or something.
Right, 4 or 5%.
And to be fair, you were probably getting a good effect from the CBD, which we've seen can be helpful for anxiety and different things like that without the THC element. And the kids are smoking today now, 25, 40%. And in mass quantities, like you said, vaping allows it to be concentrated, or wax, where you can even get THC levels even higher. So the point isn't a little relaxation with the psychedelic. It is a complete annihilation of your senses, and then the emergency room visits go up because a lot of people get paranoia, anxiety. There's the negative effects of marijuana. So it is how it's used, and it is the perception of it. And then, of course, marijuana, like other drugs, you get a tolerance eventually.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to, it is how it's used. I'm not trying to make a political statement because I think it could be used responsibly in very low doses by certain people who are not prone to addiction. But I don't think that's the majority of people.
Yeah.
I think that's the minority. And so how do you, how do we deal with it? Same with alcohol. Alcohol is glorified right now. It's glorified in movies. It's glorified in television. They stopped letting cigarette companies have commercials on television years ago, right? Well, how many alcohol commercials do you see a week? And alcohol is your identity. Oh, if you're this type of person, you drink craft beer. If you're this type of person, you drink Bud Light. If you like this kind of music, you drink Blue Caraco. If you like this kind of vacation, you drink rum. If you go to Europe, you drink whiskey or you drink sangria. You know, there's all of this identity with it. And alcohol, it is how you use it, right? But it is a very addicting substance and can lead to various problems. So
yeah, I guess my view, you know, somebody once asked me, what's the most dangerous drug? The most dangerous drug is the one that gets you. And, you know, so it's obviously drugs like the opiates or cocaine or methamphetamines or even alcohol have significantly higher risks than others. In terms of with cocaine and stimulants, the cardiovascular system is stressed dramatically. With the opiates, they can simply fade away and not wake up and aspirate. And same alcohol withdrawal can be, you know, people can suffer strokes and die. But it's really the drug or the activities that take over your life. I think it's best understood. One of the most useful books for me was Carolyn Knapp's book, Drinking: A Love Story. And she conceptualized alcoholism and addiction as primarily well aware of all the physiological factors, the genetic predisposition. It is still primarily a relationship problem. When a substance becomes your primary relationship, all other relationships suffer. Your relationship with your loved ones, with your co-workers, with yourself becomes secondary to this substance or this pattern of behavior. If it's a behavioral addiction, everything takes a back seat, and that's the real cost. And I found that her conceptualization one of the most useful ways of understanding addiction. That as she said, you know, I fell in love with alcohol and I had to fall out of love because it was killing me. But it really, her life gradually, and it wasn't by plan or design. It isn't for anybody. You know, I have never, in all the meetings I've been to, and I've been to over 1,000 meetings, I'm sure, in the past 18 years, and met plenty of people that have struggled with drugs or alcohol. I have yet to meet one who said, you know, I woke up one day and said, I'd like to be an addict. I'd like to go to jail. I'd like to alienate my family. I'd like to underperform. Nobody plans on this. It takes over your life because, you know, as I said earlier, the problem with alcohol and drugs is they work. And they do make you feel better. But there's a cost when it becomes aggressive.
That is a very good way to put it, because we, you know, on this show, we were trying to educate people, because this is about the relationship you have with others, and it's about the relationship with yourself. And so how this interview goes, I like to take a stance of education and let people make their decisions. And research, like you read books, you worked on this, is how you're able to write a book, and I do like that analogy of it. It is a relationship. And at times, what's at stake? The relationship with yourself. We lose that. If you lose that, and it's impacted and distorted through whatever drug or, you know, of choice, that's when you lose judgment. And so it does come down to really being honest with ourselves about, if you use any substance at all, whatever you use, alcohol or food even can be an addiction, but alcohol or drugs or food or whatever, what are the pros and what are the cons? And what do I like about it, and what do I not like about it? And am I in denial of my hangover and how that affects my next day? Or am I in reality about it? And am I okay with that hangover? Or am I okay with feeling some short-term memory loss after smoking or whatever? And I think that gives people a personal choice. And I think when people if you're not full-on addicted to something, if you really make it about having an adult decision to use or not use, and it's about you and what you want in your life, I think that's when people can start to be in recovery of whatever it is, or never get to the point of addiction. But if you're not sure what your relationship is to a drug or a substance or a food, and it's sort of nebulous or sort of unconscious, that's when there's danger. And if you aren't educated about what you're ingesting, whether it be food or alcohol or drugs, that can be dangerous too, because everything has an effect on us. And usually it's not a black and white. There's multiple effects. And you can classify them how you will. There's the obvious ones we already talked about, but I think that's what it gets down to, and I think that's a difficult thing for adults, let alone in our culture, to really have that kind of nuanced ability to kind of look at a bigger picture, a wider view of what you're doing with your time and your behavior and what you're ingesting. So, bringing it back around, that's why it's so important for parents and loved ones of anyone who's got an addiction to start empowering themselves with knowledge and getting that support and learning what they can do and also what isn't useful, which we found out. And, for you personally, you made those decisions based on what you heard in the meetings and what you read. And so that's kind of my summary. For adults, we can try this way, but there are, clinical, you probably need clinical help if you're not sure. If you're not sure what to do, find a professional who is certified in some type of substance treatment program or something like that, or has a great deal of knowledge, and pick up a few books, because if you're not sure, something's probably not going right.
Yeah, if you think there may be a problem, it's worth looking at. And we've talked a bit about the families and family treatment. One of the things that's best to understand, I think, for families is that you end up possibly becoming addicted to the addict or the alcoholic in your family, where you have all the symptoms that they do, which is cravings and preoccupation. They're focused on the alcohol and drugs. You're focused on them. Withdrawal. They feel lost when they can't use. You feel lost when you can't keep an eye on them all the time. Tolerance. They can tolerate more than ever, and you learn to tolerate behavior you would have never tolerated from others, on and on. And I think when parents get to that point and say, I'm addicted to my kid in terms of I can't feel good unless I think they're doing good, that's a perilous way to live. You can feel bad, but if your well-being depends on their well-being, that's not a good sign.
Well, it's definitely a warning sign.
Yes.
And so I think that's a perfect summary of a lot of what we discussed today. And if people want to learn more, Killing the Bear, Surviving Teen Addiction is the book by Andrew Tennison. I'll have the link for that. I really appreciate you coming on the show, but I want to give you a chance to say anything that you feel like you left out that you want to talk to the listeners about.
Well, I guess if anything, I think I mentioned it earlier, but I'll mention it again. It's important to set boundaries and limits for your loved one, to understand that you're not helping them sometimes when you think you are, but it's more important, or just as important, to provide hope and to convey to them that you fully expect them, that they're capable of recovery themselves, and the best way for you to support that is to get into your own form of recovery or therapy, and heal yourself. Someone once said the best sermon is not a sermon; it's a changed life. And when they'll see it in ourselves if we get better. It's no guarantee they'll get better, but it certainly helps.
Absolutely. And what better way to end this? But yes, leading by example. It's more powerful than any lecture and any book you can throw on someone's desk, is a transformed life. So I appreciate all of your wise words, and I thank you for sharing this experience on the podcast. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be interested. Is there any way they could email you, or is that more through, do you have any sort of marketing way they could email you questions, or you're more just the author at this point?
Well, I'm right now. I'm just the author at this point. I do have a Facebook account. I frankly have to admit I don't do much with it, but
Right.
It would be a way to get in touch with me. But
well, you're not active in the treatment center anymore.
No,
you're attending meetings and kind of helping families as a service.
Right.
So I wanted to make sure I offered that up, but I guess I will say, obviously, I run a clinic in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we'll talk about that at the end. So if you have questions about this and where to get treatment, I will have some links in the show notes, and you can also send me an email, and I will do my best to triage. I've got a lot of books I recommend, including this book. I've got different support groups. Al-Anon, Parents of Addicted Loved Ones is a good group. Smart Recovery is a great group. Obviously, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Marijuana Anonymous. There's lots of resources, and finding a treatment center in your area, if you're into the treatment part of this, that does a family program, that's essential in my view. And if you're not sure what's going on with your kid and you want to bring them to a therapist, I would definitely recommend finding a therapist who specializes or at least has knowledge of substance use issues. And as a parent of a minor, you can always drug test them. That's a right, and you can always look at their phone. That's a right until they're 18. You have a right over what's going on, just to be sure, because as I always tell parents, we want to set these boundaries. We want to give hope. We want to be encouraging on one hand. On the other hand, there's always a hand over the red button, which is this is an emergency, this person's out of control, and they need intervention immediately, and that means the hospital or 911 or a treatment center. So I love how you balanced hope with boundaries. You can't do one without the other. If we give hope, it's false hope. Where's the accountability? And if we only focus on accountability, we're only hitting one part of it, and there's going to be reactions from that. So if you're out there and you're looking for help, keep looking and get involved. That's the biggest thing we could say from this show. So that's what I got.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. Thank you.
When I was a good boy, young with my conscience, running around holding hands and selling lemonade, flipping coins on a watch, reflected sunsets of old Abraham, or judging when I was a good boy, young.
And there you have it. This has been another episode of the Intentional Clinician Podcast with Paul Krauss. If you're enjoying it, please share it with people you know. I would surely appreciate it. I certainly enjoyed my conversation with Andrew. If you want to check out his book, the link will be in the show notes, Killing the Bear, Surviving Teen Addiction. He's a fantastic writer, and I actually hope he releases some more of his old articles and some other things. I know he's writing right now. I believe he's in the middle of writing another book, which I've got to keep on the down low. Until next time, on The Intentional Clinician, I'm wishing you all a safe and peaceful week. If you're a clinician and you're looking for electronic medical records that are reliable and easy to use, I recommend Simple Practice. If you're interested in trying out Simple Practice, I have a link in the notes of this episode for a 30-day free trial. If you utilize the link and decide to subscribe, this podcast will get a small referral fee. I thank you in advance. Now for the disclaimer. The recording you just listened to consists of the personal opinions of Paul Krauss and his guest, and while these are based upon literature they have read and their experience in the field, this should not be viewed as the definitive opinion on this or any other subjects. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for treatment. If you are in a crisis, please dial 911 right now or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. If you are in need of counseling, do not hesitate to make an appointment with your local counselor in your area. You can make an appointment with the excellent clinicians in Grand Rapids at Health for Life Grand Rapids and the Trauma Informed Counseling Center of Grand Rapids by visiting our website, www.healthforlifegr.com. If you want to know more about me, my name is Paul Krauss, and you can find me on my Counseling Supervisor website, where I soon hope to be giving some courses. And I am doing some consulting, though I don't have a website up about this yet. I'm doing some private consulting for people that is not counseling, but just different individuals who are looking to do something creative in their career or in their personal life, or making a large change, and this would be in addition to maybe counseling they're going to, or just something different entirely. I'm not doing that for many people. It has to be a special circumstance. And I hope to offer this to organizations as well. I still am doing trainings for multiple organizations in Arizona, and I do enjoy those. And I'm looking forward to learning how to present the EMDR curriculum, which I'm in training for right now. So thanks for listening. This has been Paul Krauss. I hope you liked this podcast.